Coming up, attacks intensify between President Trump and presidential candidate Joe Biden after clashes between protesters and Trump supporters turned violent. We'll discuss with former New York Democratic Party Executive Director Bassett Michael. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. From New York, I'm Sherry Ann.
And in Washington, D.C., I'm Kevin Cirilli. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and radio. Presidential candidate Joe Biden is accusing President Trump of spurring violence after the fatal shooting of a man in Portland over the weekend. The city saw clashes between supporters of President Trump and the Black Lives Matter protesters. Both Biden and Trump will be addressing the issue later today. For more on the unrest sweeping cities across the nation, let's bring in Bassett Michael. He is the former executive director of the Democratic Party in New York, a former aide to Hillary Clinton, and a lecturer at Columbia University. Bassett, Biden is speaking outside of Pittsburgh, and he's going to be speaking with police officers and calling for there to be some type of healing and de-escalation to the violence. The president is pushing this issue of law and order. What does Joe Biden have to communicate this afternoon in just under an hour in order to get back on track with his messaging on this issue?
Quite frankly, he has to communicate to law enforcement, but also to community leaders, African Americans, Black and brown voters across the country, and the broader sort of electorate, that there is a pathway out of this. There is a way that we can come together, we can heal our country, we can create dialogue and get us back to strong footing where we have the ability to interact with each other without this kind of unrest and this violence. Certainly, communities of color are going to want harder, more firm solutions about how to change police culture and police behavior so these kinds of activities, these kinds of shootings that involve police officers don't continue to happen. But I think Joe Biden's in a unique place where he can, when he can talk to voters about finding a way forward. Unfortunately, the kind of rhetoric that Donald Trump has used is almost a self-fulfilling prophecy. He talks about unrest and needing law and order, but then he wants to be the person to come in and be able to provide that law and order in ways that particularly seem to be to most very heavy-handed. So I think Joe Biden has a very difficult road ahead of him, but the truth is that's what leaders do. They step up and step into the moment.
Yeah, it was so interesting, Bassett, because now prediction markets forecast that the disorder will actually help the president, the incumbent right now. So how successful has President Trump been in really portraying himself as an outsider, that he's going to come in and try to bring that law and order when he's actually the president of the United States?
Well, it's not so much the outsider handle so much as it is the fact that law and order, politics and rhetoric typically works for Republicans. It's a place that Democrats are viewed as not being particularly strong. It's a fine line that so many have to walk. And look, right after the shooting of George Floyd, you had, the murder of George Floyd, you had a lot of conversation around how do you change, how do you fix the system? And you realize that 95% of the elected prosecutors in this country are white. Less than 2% are African American, certainly fewer than that are women. And so when you think about the fact that, you know, there are a lot of folks of color that are running for these offices that aren't presumed to be strong and tough on crime, and you have a lot of voters saying that they want that, that's where Republicans and conservatives have done very well. So it's a language and a rhetoric and a tactic that has worked in the past, that Trump is counting on it working going forward. But what we need to have more conversation about is how he's actually stirred the pot as well and not stepped into that moment and had any kind of dialogue that seems to be moving toward healing this unrest. And that's where I think the real concern comes, and why, you know, even if the markets are responding positively to him, it's because in many ways that message has worked in a lot of places.
Well, Basil, I mean, it's a tale of two competing poll crosstabs where you've got President Trump trailing, but truly trailing on the issue of race relations, but winning on the issue of law and order. So the pollsters ask the question whichever way they won, and you get a different result. But to this point, what pressure do mayors across the country, particularly Portland, Oregon, what pressure do they have to accept federal aid, even if they don't like the tone of the invitation in which the president is offering it?
Well, they could always talk about how that aid is going to be used. Look, here in New York, for those who've been around here long enough, they remember that, we had tremendous problems with crime here in the late 80s and into the early 90s as it was going down. David Dinkins, first African-American mayor of the city of New York, actually went to the federal government to ask for more funding for police officers to put more cops on the street to help solve the crime problem. Rudy Giuliani got all the credit for it, but it really did start under him. There are mayors and governors that don't mind federal aid. How they use it is really where the rubber meets the road. The tools that they use, the manner in which they engage both police and community really makes all the difference. If you use a very heavy-handed approach, you're going to get results that you don't want or that create the kind of unrest that we've seen. We saw that in New York with shootings of Amadou Diallo, for example, with Abner Louima, and there are countless names that I haven't mentioned. But when you employ those types of tactics, you get those kinds of results. If you have a different focus, it's not just about policing, but about also justice and crime prevention, then we go a little further in solving those problems. But getting the money in and of itself is not the issue. It's how it's used and manifested that is the bigger problem.
Basil Michael, always great having your thoughts. Thank you, former head of the New York State Democratic Party. Right, coming up, the latest from President Trump's visit to Louisiana and Texas, where Hurricane Laura hit. We'll speak with